This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the Power Sector Podcast, Michael Goggin, Vice President for Power System Consultant Grid Strategies, is going to explain the official findings on the causes of the huge April 28 Iberian Peninsula power outage. And he's going to talk about what that system's operator, Red Electrica, found to be the best solutions to avoid that kind of event. Michael's been Grid Strategies Vice President since 2018. His decades of research in transmission and clean energy optimization makes him one of the nation's foremost power sector authorities. He's filed expert testimony over 100 times with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and state utility commissions. Michael, what happened in Spain and Portugal? And what did Spanish system operator Red Electra find were the causes of the event? And maybe as important, what did it specifically find were not causes of the event?
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, Herman. There were two reports that came out last week. One was from the Spanish government, and then one was from the grid operator Red Electrica, as you mentioned. And these reports, I think, are generally aligned in finding that the primary cause was a failure of the conventional synchronous generators, nuclear and gas generators, to adequately regulate voltage on the power system. And voltage is analogous to pressure in a water system. It's necessary to ensure the efficient delivery of electricity from power plants to your home. And in situations where voltage is not adequately controlled, it can lead to an event where you have an entire power system collapse, which is what happened in Spain. So what these reports find is that over the course of that morning, on this is April 28th, so a couple of months ago, about 12:30 in the afternoon is when the blackout happened. But for the several hours preceding that event, the grid operator was already seeing oscillations on the power system, and they were seeing voltage kind of widely ranging around by about 10%, which is not something you usually want to see. You want to kind of control voltage and have it pretty finely tuned. They were also seeing some frequency oscillations. And so, first of all, I think this shows that there was a lack of voltage control on the power system that morning and going into the event. And the reports document that many of the power plants that were supposed to be regulating voltage, and again, these were all synchronous, conventional thermal power plants. Some of them
Hey,
were not
Michael,
adequately. Yeah, go ahead.
let me just stop you right there. Their synchronous generators are, like you say, conventional power plants, natural gas, coal, nuclear. That's different from the renewables. Renewables are not synchronous generators and not part of the failure here, right? Am I right about that?
That's correct. Yeah. So, wind and solar photovoltaic are inverter-based resources, which are fully asynchronous. Spain does have some solar thermal generators that are synchronous. They do feed a steam turbine. However, those plants were not regulating voltage. So on this day, the voltage control was being provided entirely by fossil generators and nuclear generators.
Okay, sorry to interrupt you, but I
No,
thought
that's great.
clear.
It's an important distinction, yes. And so the thermal synchronous generators were having trouble controlling voltage. Some of them were actually exacerbating voltage control problems. When they should have been reducing voltage, they were doing things that actually increased voltage. And so that's obviously very problematic. And these power plants were being paid to provide this service. And so we see several events over the course of the morning where it's indicative that there's a failure to adequately control voltage. As the grid operator is struggling to deal with these oscillations in the system, they are taking steps to dampen the oscillation, basically kind of stop this feedback effect that starts happening. And the consequence of some of those actions was to actually increase voltage. And so what you see in about the 10 minutes preceding the blackout, voltage is steadily increasing. The grid operator notices this and starts taking steps to bring the voltage back down. And they are in the process of doing that. They start trying to fire up two combined cycle plants. Unfortunately, that takes a bit of time. It was going to take about an hour and a half and about 2 hours to bring on those power plants. And unfortunately, they ran out of time. The blackout happened 10 minutes later, so those plants never came online in time to bring in additional voltage control. And so what we see in coming into the minute of the event, preceding the blackout, is voltage is steadily increasing, and then it starts this cascading effect where generators start tripping offline as the voltage is rapidly going up. And this happens in a few places. There were some transformers that connect multiple generators, and because of the speed of change of the voltage, the transformers weren't able to keep up and modulate their control of voltage, and they tripped, and then that took the generation offline. And the problem is that when you lose generation in this circumstance, it causes voltage to increase. And so that kind of created this positive feedback, this cascading effect where the voltage is going up, that causes generators to trip, which causes the voltage to go up even higher. And so voltage really just kind of goes on this runaway positive feedback. And you start just losing generators very quickly in rapid succession as you get down that feedback. And within a course of a minute, the voltage, you lose so much generation. The voltage is very high. The frequency starts dropping because you've lost all of this generation. There's just a fundamental imbalance on the Iberian Peninsula between supply and demand because you're losing all of this generation. And so the transmission ties that Spain has to France and to Morocco, they do what they're supposed to do in that situation, which is control the problem, and basically the transmission ties cut. They were way over capacity, and you want to actually cut ties in that situation because you would have potentially destabilized the entire European power system if you didn't, basically isolate the problem to Spain. So the ties isolate. I'll talk a little bit more about the ties. I think if they were larger ties, they could have maybe stabilized the situation better. That's one of the recommendations in the government report, is to expand those ties. But regardless, at this point, it was I think there was no way to contain this problem. The Spanish system was going to black out, and that's what happens in very rapid succession over that course of a matter of seconds, as you just lose massive amounts of generation. So that's what happened. And luckily, I think that the grid operators did a really good job at restoring power. They were able to use those transmission ties to bring in voltage and frequency and to kind of restart the system. And that happened very quickly, 12 to 18 hours after the blackout. So that was, I think, a positive. The restoration was very quick. And I think, the people of Spain and Portugal were probably very happy to have the lights back on.
As we all would be if we were left in the dark. Let me just check a couple things, go over that a little bit, like a second time, Michael. So you have a system, the electrons are flowing along at a steady frequency of 50 cycles per second. That's a technical term, but it's important that the frequency stays close to 50 cycles per second in Europe. In the US, it's 60, right?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. And you've got a relatively steady voltage, which is the push of the electrons through the system to meet the demand on the system. Now, you mentioned in your report that there were some minor oscillations, and you pointed out that it's when wind was off the system that the oscillations got a little worse. That's a little curious. Do you have anything more to offer in terms of that insight?
Yeah, so in my write-up, I did include an example. It was from the U.S. power system, and it was just like a chart showing that people have done real experiments where you turn wind plants on and off, and you can see that they are very good at regulating voltage. So that was not that chart was not from this event. The wind was online, and I think if we're getting into what caused this, and the recommendations coming out of the report. The primary recommendation of both the grid operator, Red Electrica, and the government report is that inverter-based resources like wind and solar and batteries be used to regulate voltage. That is not done in Spain. They only use the conventional synchronous thermal generators or synchronous generators to provide voltage support. In this country and in many other countries, we use inverter-based resources, so wind, solar, batteries, to regulate voltage because they are very good at it. They're very fast and very accurate in providing the reactive power and the voltage support that's needed. In the U.S., we've required for nearly the last 10 years. There was a order from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in 2016 that all new inverter-based resources from that point forward have to provide voltage and reactive power support that's equivalent to that provided by conventional generators. NERC standards require this. So it's something that we've gone in a different direction. we've used these really good capabilities of the inverter-based resources to quickly and accurately regulate voltage. And now what the Spain, both the government and the grid operator are recommending is that they do the same thing, that they not only,
Go ahead.
sorry, go ahead. Yeah, that they not only allow the inverter-based resources to do this, but that they basically create a mechanism of selecting the least cost resources that can provide voltage support at any point in time as needed, and then choose the lowest cost ones. And so I think they're going to see a large uptick in inverter-based resources providing this service. The report notes that a huge, many gigawatts of their wind and solar fleet can provide this service today.
Yeah,
They're just being barred from doing so by these antiquated rules. And I think they'll see, improvements in economics and reliability from doing that. The report notes that what happens often today is they'll keep a thermal power plant, a gas power plant on just to regulate voltage, and they
right.
don't
Well,
need
that's
they don't need the power from it, but they're just using it for the voltage, and so that's an
right.
inefficient outcome for everybody. It increases the
That, that,
cost.
that,
It's not
that's
reliable. Yeah.
that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. I want to get into that in a little more detail. Um, so you've got these oscillations in the voltage, and they're
Mhm.
getting worse because when the voltage goes up, the electrons are flowing fast, and they've got no place to go because the supply that's demanding them isn't there. Is that correct?
That's roughly right. Yeah, I mean the loss of the generation makes the voltage go up. Some of the other things that the grid operator was doing of bringing lines back into service were also, that was helping to dampen these oscillations, but it also causes the voltage to go up. And so,
Right.
yeah, it was like
Voltage
they were.
goes up because the system wants to keep feeding what appears to be, because the voltage is rising, uh, the need for electrons to keep going through the system. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean that's generally what the voltage does. Again, it's just kind of like the efficient flow of the power, and yeah, I mean basically you can think of it as like the pressure was going up, and
Yeah,
and losing
had
this
nowhere to
generation.
go.
Yeah,
Yeah. So this is what was interesting, is that the conventional synchronous generators were supposed to handle that, and the grid operator wanted to turn some of those on. And that's the point I wanted to get at. They couldn't turn the natural gas plants on in time, which is an interesting thing because the renewables have the capability of like instantaneously or almost instantaneously responding, but they've got these gas plants and other generators that they keep in service just for this purpose, just to provide the react or reduce the reactive power, if you will. Um, and yet they couldn't come on in time to stop the event. Whereas in the US, we have renewables and batteries that can do that like almost instantaneously. Am I understanding that correctly? And am I explaining it correctly?
that's absolutely right. And not only are the inverter-based resources, so the wind, solar, and batteries, able to provide fast and accurate response, they can also start up much more quickly. A battery can go basically, there's no moving parts, it just goes. And so, it's basically as quick as you want it to be in terms of you
Like
tell it to
turning
do
on your
something.
car, like
Yeah,
turning
you
on your car.
Oh yeah, I mean it's like an electric car. It goes from 0 to 100 as fast as you want, basically. Because there's no moving parts. It's just as fast as the controls are. And so, if they were in that situation where 10 minutes prior to the blackout, the operators are seeing that they've got a big voltage problem on their hand, if they had more batteries, they could have instantly, and they were using batteries to regulate voltage, they could have instantly kind of turned those plants on and or use them to regulate voltage as they need it. And that's something that, in the US, that's what we do. The batteries, as well as the wind and the solar, are providing this voltage regulation today. And the wind and solar plants are also very fast at that. Again, a solar plant has no moving parts. It starts up, with a click of a button, basically. And you can even, inverter-based resources, the power electronics that give them this capability to regulate voltage allows them to provide it and when they're producing even if the power plant is off. So, for example, a solar plant can be configured so that it can pull in grid power at night when the sun's not producing any power. The plant can pull in grid power and run that through the power electronics and regulate voltage that way if you want to. It's a capability that you can build into the plant. It exists. It may cost a little bit more to kind of set up in that way. But if you need, basically the point is that there's incredible capability of the power electronics inverter-based resources to be used to regulate voltage if you want to. And I think Spain is moving in the right direction to figure out what is the lowest cost mix of resources we want to use to regulate voltage. And that's the right way to approach it, I think.
Now, and starting up these other conventional plants, they weren't starting them up to generate more electrons into the system. They were starting them up because they had the capabilities to control the voltage. Is that correct?
That's right. They didn't need the power, the real power in terms of megawatts. If you look at, what was happening, it was two-thirds wind and solar. Power prices were approximately zero. They had more energy than they could do, than they knew what to do with. They were shipping it out to France and other places. And so they didn't need gas generation. If
Right.
anything, that was going to make the renewables curtail. But because of the rule that only conventional synchronous generators can regulate voltage, that was the only tool they had. If they needed more voltage control, which they did, they only had one tool in the toolbox, and that was the synchronous generators. And
They
so I think,
also had
yeah.
they also had limited. Sorry for interrupting, Michael.
No, you're
Forgive
good.
me. But the the other tool they had was if they had more transmission, they could have sent the electrons that were flowing that were sort of being pushed too hard. They could have sent them off to other regions, but they didn't have that transmission. It's a little bit like the Texas situation here in the U.S., right? They have limited ties, so Texas has lots of renewables, and they were one of the first organizations to let the renewables do as much as they could do to manage these situations. But they don't have the ties, and that was the situation in the Iberian Peninsula. Is that correct?
That's right. The ties that Spain has, and it's mostly through France, but there's also some tie to Morocco. It's only about 3% of the total installed capacity. The European regulation specifies that number should be more like 15%. So it's something that they've been, I think, wanting to expand anyway. These transmission ties provide a number of economic and reliability benefits. They allow you to move power around in real time. If you've got like the situation like this, where you've got high wind and solar output in Spain, you can ship that out to the rest of Europe. If you're in a situation where demand is high in Spain and renewable output is low, you can then bring in power from elsewhere and kind of capture that diversity in the timing of renewable output as well as peak demand periods. So that gives you, economic value for lower cost energy. It allows you to reduce the amount of power plant capacity you need to keep the lights on because you can count on this diversity in load and renewable output patterns when you're figuring out how many power plants you need to build. But it also helps you out during situations like this with just creating a stronger transmission network is going to give you more resilience, more redundancy, better control of frequency, better control of voltage. And that's one of the things that we saw was that a lot of the oscillations, they were both frequency and voltage oscillations. The frequency oscillations are something that's fairly common in the European system between the rest of Europe and the Iberian Peninsula because of that weak tie. Basically, things get a little bit out of sync and the frequency starts kind of moving around because if you tie together two big balls with like a little string between them, they're going to move out of sync, and you just need a stronger tie to improve that the system strength and to basically have more stability on the frequency and voltage side. And so one of the big recommendations of the government report was to continue to expand those transmission ties, which I think gives you a number of economic and reliability benefits.
Right. Well, let's go. Okay, so first of all, I mentioned earlier the frequency. The way you can imagine it is the electrons are going up and down in that classic curve, up and down, and that happens in Europe 50 times a second, in the U.S. 60 times a second. Just clarification as best as I can for what you mean when you talk about the frequency. But let's go over one more time, Michael. There were three major solutions, recommendations for solutions, as I understand. Is that correct? And just review those. We've talked about them over and over, but just quickly review those three recommendations and tell us why they're so valuable.
Yeah, I mean, well, both reports had a number of recommendations. I don't know how many, but the big ones were move away from just using synchronous resources to regulate voltage, open it up to everybody. The second big one was create a mechanism for picking the lowest cost resources that can regulate voltage. And that, involves opening it up and bringing in the inverter-based resources, the wind, solar, batteries. The government report does recommend expanding the use of battery capacity. Spain has very little battery capacity. It's under 100 megawatts, I believe. And, in the US and in many parts of the US, it's many, many times higher than that.
Yeah.
And you can use that. The batteries are extremely good at regulating both frequency and voltage. And so, the report recommends that this would increase the strength and the flexibility of the electrical system. That's what the government report says. So, adding batteries will help. And then the third primary recommendation of the government report was what I just talked about, increasing the transmission ties to the rest of Europe to, it would provide, in this case, reliability benefits in addition to, economic benefits year round.
Right. Okay. We're running out of time, Michael, but I want to just talk about go over one more time, if you will,
Mhm.
what this event and the Red Electra and the Spanish government reports revealed about what grid operators in the U.S. and other countries are doing or can do to prevent this type of event. And the reason I ask that is because, as you know, I've written about grid forming capabilities, which are which batteries have and renewables have, and which have the capability of really being even more effective in controlling these kinds of events. People have talked about bringing renewables onto the system and destabilizing it, but the folks at North American Reliability Corporation, Mark Laube, and the folks at ESIG, like Julia Matavasian, talk a lot about these grid forming capabilities. So tell us a little bit about what we've learned from this event and what we in the US and other countries are doing or can do to prevent
Mhm.
it.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, to start off with, I think we can all breathe a sigh of relief. We use inverter-based resources to regulate voltage in the US. And so a lot of the problems that caused the blackout in Spain would not happen here. I think we have a broader pool of resources that are regulating voltage. And, that includes inverter-based resources. So, the primary problem that happened in Spain would not happen here, just given the existing codes and requirements we have on our power system. As I mentioned, for over 10 or almost 10 years now, we've required inverter-based resources to regulate voltage. That said, I think there are things we can do to really tap more fully into the capabilities of inverter-based resources to regulate voltage. Right now, I think we're not very efficiently fully utilizing that capability, in part because we don't really have systematic compensation mechanisms to pay for voltage and reactive power support. There's in some regions there is some mechanism to compensate for that, but there's no standardized mechanism, and in some regions they're actually moving away from compensating that and for voltage and reactive control, and are just kind of mandating it. And I think that you know maybe has implications for reliability, but it's largely an economic issue. Are you efficiently using the right resources to regulate voltage? Are you building in the capabilities in an economically efficient way? And I think on our current system, we're not. I think, what Spain is proposing coming out of this blackout is, kind of a systematic way of looking at what is the least cost way of meeting our need for voltage and reactive power in both a planning time scale as they're, planning transmission and planning generation, as well as in a real-time operational time scale. And I think that's the right way to approach it, is what is the most efficient way to get the reliability services we need. And I think that would more fully tap into the really strong capabilities of inverter-based resources to do that. And you mentioned grid forming inverters. So basically, quick 101 on this is almost all of the wind solar batteries we have today are grid following. They take frequency and voltage signals from the other loads and generators on the power system and kind of respond to that frequency and voltage and match that voltage signal. A grid forming inverter is something that they're used today on small island power systems. So like in Hawaii, there's, grid forming batteries that kind of build that frequency and voltage signal and set it and allow the loads and other generators to respond to it. And so this is what you need to do as you move to higher and higher levels of inverter-based resources. they need to start providing that signal. It's something it doesn't cost much more to build that capability into the resource. Batteries, it's very easy to do it because they're going to be, they have energy stored, and so they can provide this service at all times. In some situations, you may want to do it with wind or solar. And I think that it gives you, certainly on the frequency control side, it gives you a lot more capabilities. You can black start a power system with a grid forming inverter.
I
You
want to
can do,
stress that, Michael.
yeah,
What you just said. The black start, what that means is if the system goes down, you can get it back up faster because these resources can start that. You don't have to start up another power plant to get it to go, right?
that's right. Yeah, and as we saw in Spain, that Black Star is not something you need very often, but when you need it, you really need it. You want to bring that system
Yeah.
back as quickly as possible. And they use their transmission ties and some of their own generation to do it. But with grid forming inverters, you can use batteries. Batteries are excellent at starting up a system.
Right.
And so that's one. But the grid forming inverters give you they give you expanded capability to regulate voltage and frequency, which in some, as you move to higher penetrations of inverter-based resources, is useful. But I do want to clarify, the garden variety grid following inverters that are the bulk of what we have on our system today, are very good at regulating voltage. And we can, I think the first step is, for Spain, is to tap into that capability, and we can, in the US, we can more fully use that capability. I think if we get in place more systematic mechanisms to kind of economically select the best resources and compensate them for providing the voltage control services we need.
Okay. All right. That's all the time we have, Michael. I want to thank my guest, Grid Strategies Vice President Michael Goggin. He's explained the official findings on the causes of the huge April 28 Iberian Peninsula blackout and the best solutions for power system operators in the U.S. to avoid a similar event, and how, by the way, the U.S. is already in many ways, thanks to renewables, protected from that kind of event. I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.